Environment, and item 7 on biodiversity and agriculture. Also, if we work efficiently, we may able to consider item 3 as well. We will open today's plenary session by completing the first reading of item 5 of the SBSTTA-24 provisional agenda, risk assessment and risk management of living modified organisms. I kindly recall that item 5 was considered during the third and fourth segments of our informal session, respectively on 19 and 24 February 21. At that time, interventions were heard from 21 parties, with 3 additional parties having submitted an undelivered written submission. 2 non-parties, 2 regional groups, and 5 observers, with an additional written submission received from 2 observers. Colleagues, I would like to remind you that we are on a very tight schedule and that our time together is limited. In order to respect our schedule for the day, I would like to ensure that we complete this item by the break time at about 8:20, 8:25 Montreal time. With your kind cooperation, we will be able to hear from major stakeholders groups and other observers once we have heard from all parties requesting the floor. I thank you in advance for your comprehension and collaboration. I'll give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce the item. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. On item 5, the Secretariat has prepared the document CBD/SBSTTA/24/5, Risk Assessment and Risk Management, to report on actions taken pursuant to Decision 913. The document has 3 sections that together present background from the Decision 913, an overview of activities carried out during the intersessional period, and a draft recommendation for consideration by the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. The document is complemented by 7 information documents, as you can see on the screen. The subsidiary body is invited to consider these documents and provide a recommendation as to whether additional guidance materials on risk assessment are needed for living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives and living modified fish for consideration by the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol at its 10th meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Before I open the floor for interventions, in order to increase efficiency, I will ask those parties, regional groups and observers that deliver a statement on this theme at the informal session to take the floor only in the event that you wish to make a significant additional points to add to your previous intervention at the informal session and to focus on the recommendations in the document. In such cases, please mention those changes briefly and provide them in writing within 12 hours of the closure of this meeting. For minor changes, you may simply resubmit your statement. In developing the CRP or non-paper for this agenda item, all comments and suggestions made in your statements, whether in February or today, will be considered carefully. I would like to reiterate that all requests from the floor by parties to the Cartagena Protocol will be heard this agenda item. The statements by non-parties to the protocol, other governments, stakeholder groups, other observers will also be heard as time allows. Before I begin, I would like to remind you that as you speak, your interventions are being translated into the 5 other official UN languages by a dedicated team of interpreters. To facilitate their challenging work and make sure that we can all understand each other, please keep the following in mind. Despite the time limit on your interventions, do not race, read at a pace that allow interpreters to follow you. Keep background noise to a minimum. You can do this by wearing noise-canceling headset and microphone sets. Check your sound using your own voice before joining the session, and upload your statements prior to delivery rather than after. Well, I also like to mention that we are improving the system, and there's a new integrated timer in the interaction platform that will be operational as of today. The timer is located at the top center of your screens beside the language selection bar. The clock will turn in orange, then red in the last 20 seconds of your allowed time. Please keep track on your time and read slowly. Okay, so I will take the first, now I open the floor for interventions on item 5, risk assessment, risk management of living modified organisms, starting with regional groups, followed by parties, and then by observers. Just wait a second, please. It is taking time to start properly today. Okay. Well, I have in the list I'm wondering about the regional interventions. I see this way. Well, I have Brazil. Are you speaking on behalf of the GRULAC region? Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, Mr. Chairman, I apologize, but actually my delegation has been waiting to take the floor since yesterday. We asked for the floor before you close the agenda item 4, and taking into account your advice to make best use of our time, that's why I want to ask your understanding, and we want to raise our concern regarding the mandate you gave to the contact group on agenda item 4, because we understand that we should discuss, before discussing potential the annex that you mentioned, there should be a decision on whether synthetic biology should be considered a new emerging issue or not. So in order to make a better use of our time, I would strongly recommend you to reconsider your decision and to, instead of start the working of the CG4 on the annex, that we actually take the and not preempt the negotiations and go first what's need to be decided first. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. Well, when in the mandate for the working group, for the contact group, I think we can make progress on these particular points I gave already. And of course, when preparing the CRP, we already received a number of comments, and I'm thinking also to make a proposal on that point, that we can see it at the CRP when it's ready, so we can also address that point during plenary. But first, to take the different elements as I mentioned in the mandate. I mean, it doesn't mean that that point will not be taken but first to give priority to these points. Let's see how the contact group evolves. If they can cover these elements, maybe we can have some time, but of course it will be some considerations of these elements when we see the CRP and we go to the respective section. I hope that clarifies. It doesn't mean we're not going to address it. We will do it, but first to have these points. And thank you for that comment. Well, now I give the floor to Indonesia, followed by Morocco.
Indonesia.
Can we try again with Indonesia? Maybe you need to close one of the two devices.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished delegate and colleague, on this agenda item, Indonesia would like to propose that due to the fast development of living LMO across the globe, Indonesia deems LMO issues are very important and crucial. This is pursuant to the great potential of each genetic modification and, like the two sides of coin, its negative impact that might jeopardize our biodiversity and human health. In living modified fish, Indonesia is currently working on our national legal framework and policies strengthening to manage the usage and release or reintroduction of new fish species, including those from genetic engineering process. Therefore, we share the notion to improve management of GM products, including through the study of ad hoc technical expert group on risk assessment to develop additional guidance for LMO's risk assessment. As a reminder, in COVID-34, Indonesia called for FAO's support on discussion of living modified fish in CBD. We require an action plan and policy response related to living modified fish. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. Now I give the floor to Morocco, speaking on behalf of the African region.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. No, I wish to speak on behalf of Morocco.
Wait for a while when I open the floor for practice. Meanwhile,
Okay.
I have South Africa. No. Belarus. Belarus, you have the floor. Is Belarus speaking on behalf of the region, the Central and Eastern Europe? You have the floor. Seems it's not working. Then I have Finland. I believe was speaking on behalf of the EU.
No, sir. I will not be speaking on behalf of the EU and its member states. I will be speaking on behalf of Finland. I am sorry, I had some technical problems and had to log out and was not quite sure where you are in the list. Sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you.
No problem. Let's try again with the regional statements. The last request is Belarus. I see I'm facing some technical problems. Let's see if it works now. Belarus. If it's not the case, we can try later. So now I open the floor for interventions from parties for the Cartagena Protocol to take the floor. Now you can raise your hands. I see Morocco, followed by Korea and South Africa. Morocco, you have the floor now.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. The existing guidelines on risk assessment offer a good basis for assessing LMOs that have been developed through classic engineering, genetic engineering. However, there still are gaps regarding the new dimensions of modern biotechnology, which is the case for genetically engineered LMOs. Release of organisms with engineered genes that have been modified in a targeted fashion could modify the genetic makeup of whole populations because of the evolutionary advantage that these organisms have. Once they are released into the environment, it could become very difficult to control or to eliminate these organisms. And they could affect biodiversity beyond national borders or outside of the initially targeted populations. Secondly, Morocco believes that the existing basis for risk assessment should be reviewed or adapted in order to align them in a consistent fashion on the relevant objective of the Cartagena Protocol at the local level. And we support a risk assessment on a case-by-case and evidence-based approach basis. And support a decision-making process that evaluates all the risks regarding the advantages, taking into account everyone's viewpoint. Morocco believes that the recommendation made by SBSTTA to the COPMOP of the Cartagena Protocol should guarantee a process of identification, prioritization of specific issues regarding the risks of LMOs that should be reviewed in future. In the case of engineered gene drive LMOs and the assessment of their risks, we must quickly fill in the gaps through guidance to the parties of the Cartagena Protocol. The guidance material should be prepared in stages, first by qualified specialists within the ATEG process, and also should undergo a wide discussion involving all stakeholders. And it is clear that capacity building is essential with a continued sharing of knowledge in order to meet the needs set forward by the parties regarding the assessment and management of LMO risks. I wanted to tell you that I didn't see the countdown of the timer on my screen. I hope that I stayed within the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morocco. I hope the counter can improve. I barely see it, but let's keep moving. You were on time. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Korea, followed by South Africa and Finland. Korea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Republic of Korea would like to thank the Secretariat for collecting and organizing relevant information so that online forums and ATEC can be operated. In addition, our appreciation goes to the ATEC for their contributions in relation to risk assessment and management agendas. Since risk assessment and management are essential and scientific fields that enable safe movement of genetically modified organisms between countries, Korea has aligned itself with the idea of developing risk assessment guidances in various fields such as plants, trees, and mosquitoes. In this regard, Korea supports Switzerland's statement proposed at the informal session in preparation for SBSTTA-24, which was held in February this year, that is necessary to develop the guidances on risk assessment for both types of organisms, LM fish and organisms containing engineering gene drives, which has potential risk of affecting biodiversity on a wider scale across borders once released into the environment. As in the case of development of risk assessment guidance for LM trees and mosquitoes, which were added after the development of risk assessment guidance for LM crops, Korea also believes that those two guidelines are necessary. In particular, LM fish guidance can be crucial to provide countries with a sufficient review of the potential risk of LM fish to aquatic ecosystems. Korea also endorses the establishment of ATEC for further guidance development. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Korea. Now I give the floor to South Africa, followed by Finland and Brazil.
Thank you so much, Chair. South Africa supports the statement made by Ethiopia on behalf of the Africa Group during the informal session of SBSTTA and joins other in welcoming the outcomes of the discussion on the ad hoc technical aspect on risk assessment. South Africa supports the decision not to develop at this stage additional guidance materials on the assessment of living modified fish, recognizing the various resources that can be sufficient in addressing risk assessment needs for LM fish. However, we also wanted to point out in paragraph 8 of the ITEC report on the data on the release of non-modified, non-indigenous fish and lessons from commercial fish farming, which may be a source of experience that can inform potential environmental effects of living modified fish. South Africa therefore invites parties to share information on experience with undertaking risk assessment for LM fish, using appropriate non-leaf comparators on the BCH. Therefore, we request for a specific recommendation in this regard to keep the work under GM fish going, since this is linked to economic activities in some of the developing parties. South Africa also notes the recommendation on the ITEC that guidance for risk assessment on living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives should be developed, recognizing the scientific uncertainties of their potential impact on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. South Africa would like to reiterate paragraph 2 of decision and paragraph 11 of decision 14 and 19, which urge parties and invite other governments to take a precautionary approach when addressing the threats posed by living LMOs containing gene drives to biological diversity in accordance with the domestic legislation and other relevant international obligations, and the carrying out of scientifically sound case-by-case risk assessment and a decision-making process that weighs risk against benefits, including the perspective of indigenous people and local communities as may be appropriate. South Africa also notes the ITEC's conclusion that resources related to risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drive do exist, and that this could be useful resources when undertaking the risk assessment. However, South Africa continues to note with concern that some developing countries still do not have functional national South Africa continues to note with concern that some developing countries still do not have functional national biosafety frameworks and nor the capacity to conduct the risk assessment. Therefore, we would like to reiterate paragraph 5 of decision 39 for a broad international and regional cooperation, knowledge sharing and capacity building support to support parties in this regard. South Africa also notes the decision to establish the ITAC, and in order to develop additional guidance, South Africa would like to reaffirm the previous decision on the need for a coordinated and complementary and non-duplicative approach on issues related to synthetic biology under the convention and its protocol in relation to issues on engineered gene drive. We will be submitting our written inputs and draft recommendation to the Secretariat in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, South Africa. I see in the list that Belarus is again, and in the understanding that is providing a regional statement, I give the floor to Belarus. I hold the technical issues are now solved. You have the floor, Belarus.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, it's not regional statement, it's a statement from the country. So
Okay.
should I wait for?
Yes, please wait.
Thank you.
We will continue with the list. Now I give the floor to Finland, followed by Brazil and the EU. Finland, you have the floor.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, because my device didn't work the way it usually does. Sorry about that delay. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. And
We cannot hear Finland. Maybe we can try later. I will meanwhile continue with the list. Let's go with Brazil, followed by EU and France. Brazil, you have the floor.
Dr. Benitez, the success of a chair is measured by the broad consensus he helps to generate. Because of our Latin American friendship, my delegation wants you to be very successful, and that's why you feel obliged to call your attention to guide us toward consensus and not push us in the opposite direction. I'll read my statement on the agenda item 5. From the outset, Brazil highlights that we should not let the title of this agenda item to mislead the discussions on our living modified organisms. There is a growing body of scientific evidence demonstrating the promising applications of gene drives, especially for the control and reduction of disease vectors that affect developing countries, or to address sustainable agriculture and foster the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Hence, we consider that the discussions on this topic must be approached in a balanced manner, taking into consideration equally the risks and the potential benefits when using living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives. Brazil welcomes the discussions and outcomes of the ATAG on risk assessment. We are grateful for the dedicated work of the experts that took part in this exercise. My delegation also takes this opportunity to express its appreciation for the support provided by the Secretary to that group. To summarize, Brazil agrees that it's not necessary to develop, at this stage, additional voluntary guidance materials on risk assessment regarding living modified fish. We also agree that we should continue this exercise on scientific-based discussions with an ITAG on risk assessment to develop additional voluntary guidance materials on risk assessment for living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives. However, we have some comments to the suggested terms of reference, which you send in written. Last but not least, when discussing living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives, we must consider the significant challenge in developing a one-size-fits-all approach, given the wide range of applications of engineered gene drives and their specific nature and scope. This could lead to a misunderstanding of gene drives' implications and pave the way for unnecessary barriers to biotechnology research, development, and innovation. An efficient initiative would be to engage in improving existing risk assessment frameworks by building on available scientific evidence and considering the many types of existing gene drives to support case-by-case analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brazil. I understand you also have some suggestions for terms of reference of the ATEC, so we will welcome to see them as well. Now we give the floor to the EU, followed by France and Mexico.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor to speak on behalf of the European Union. Distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, the European Union included its most important views and suggestions in the statement delivered at the informal session of SBSTTA. That statement is still valid. Further, we would like to take this opportunity today and raise 3 other points. Firstly, we believe that there is considerable guidance materials and experience on LMFIS. Therefore, we do not consider necessary to develop additional guidance materials at this stage. Available resources could be better used for the development of additional guidance materials on risk, on risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. Secondly, the European Union recommends improving capacity building, cooperation, and knowledge management in order to address the needs identified by parties on risk assessment of LMOs. The relevance and use of the Biosafety Clearinghouse should be enhanced in this context. Finally, the European Union considers important to ensure the continuation of the process established in Decision 9/13 for the identification and prioritization of specific issues of risk assessment of LMOs that may warrant future consideration. Together with this statement, the European Union has already submitted amendments to the draft recommendation. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, the EU. Now, let's try again with Finland. I hope technical issues are solved now. Finland, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I will try once again. Thank you for that. In addition to the points Finland highlighted during the informal SBSTTA meeting in February, we would like to draw your attention to the following. We support the establishment of an AHTEC, but are flexible with respect to the process to be implemented. We suggest in a new paragraph 6 bis that a group of experts, for example, within an AHTEC, develops a detailed outline and a first draft of the additional guidance materials. These should focus on specific issues of mosquitoes containing engineered gene drives and address general issues for conducting risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene. Para 6 ter, we suggest extending risk assessment, risk management online forum and suggest that the online forum reviews both the outline and the first draft of the additional guidance materials. We suggest additional text in the terms of reference of the AHTEC, suggesting that the AHTEC should develop the final draft of the additional guidance materials and include it in its report to the SBSTTA. In addition, we have suggested a new paragraph 7 bis, where we suggest that parties submit to the Executive Secretary information on their needs and priorities for further guidance materials on specific topics of risk assessment of LMOs, including a rationale reflecting the criteria set out in Annex 1 of Decision CP 9/13. Further, in the terms of reference, we suggest that the AHTEC prepares a prioritized list of these identified topics and includes this list into its report to SBSTTA. We have uploaded our statement and suggested amendments to the web page to be publicly available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Finland. Now I give the floor to France, followed by Mexico and Malaysia. France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Good day, everyone. We support the interventions made by the EU and Finland. The French delegation once again thanks the Secretariat for the intersessional work carried out. As stated before, we consider it vital to continue the work on risk assessment and risk management of living modified organisms under the Cartagena Protocol. The statement we made during the informal sessions of SBSTTA-24 remains fully valid. Therefore, we only will present some of our main proposed amendments to the draft recommendation. We believe that the additional guidance materials to be developed should both address general issues for conducting risk assessment of living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives and focus on upcoming applications in the near future. Accordingly, we propose several amendments to the draft recommendation, particularly in paragraph 6 of the draft recommendation. We remain flexible with respect to the implementation process for the development of additional guidance materials, but we have several suggestions in order to guarantee effectiveness and transparency. Accordingly, we propose several amendments to the draft recommendation and its annex. In addition to the points raised in the informal sessions, we recommend including required specific expertise in involving representatives from international organizations such as WHO, IUCN, or IPBES in the drafting process of additional guidance materials. We also recommend making use of existing guidance materials so as to avoid duplication. As stated before, this is only a brief overview of some of our proposals, and we have submitted all our proposed amendments to the draft recommendation in writing. Thank you very much.
Merci, La France. Ahora doy la palabra a México, followed by Malaysia and Germany.
I'm going to give the floor to Mexico now first, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mexico made a statement on this subject during the informal sessions, and in this respect, we maintain, I'm afraid the sound is very choppy for the speaker. So it's Mexico, it's very hard to hear you. Can you hear me now? Asks Mexico. Well, let's see. Let's start again, please. And we'll see. Mexico made a statement on this subject during the informal sessions, and in this respect, we maintain our position as already expressed, and we're taking the floor to add some points as follows. First of all, we reiterate that the precautionary approach established in Principle 15 of the Rio Summit Declaration should be taken into account given the uncertainty surrounding the release of living modified organisms. Secondly, we agree with ATEG's suggestion to focus efforts on developing guidance material about conducting risk analysis of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. However, we feel that in the future, so we consider that it's necessary that in the future we have guidance, as I've said, on risk assessment for genetically modified fish, since releases have already taken place in different parts of the world, and also considering the challenges related to the high dispersal capacity of these organisms. Thirdly, Mexico believes that it would be of relevance due to the IPLC's inextricable link with biodiversity conservation to foster research on socio-economic considerations, as well as the development of methodological frameworks that include these considerations in the risk assessments, in order to take into account the social, economic, and cultural impacts during decision-making processes. And finally, on this matter, we consider that we, in fact, have to strengthen the full and effective participation of IPLCs, as well as reinforcing capacity building on risk assessments, monitoring, and effective participation. We also have various comments on the draft recommendations that we will send directly to the Secretariat. Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Mexico.
Followed by Germany and Peru. Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished delegates, Malaysia acknowledges that the development of guidance document for living modified fish is delayed and is not a priority. However, Malaysia would like to propose that guidelines for the living modified fish should be developed eventually to provide guidance for parties that lack the expertise and experience to do risk assessment and management for living modified fish. It is the position of Malaysia that the release of organisms with engineered gene drive into the wild need to be examined with prior impact assessments. strict regulation, and a liability and redress mechanism in line with Article 14 of the Convention. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Malaysia. Now I give the floor to Germany, followed by Peru and Austria. Germany, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Germany welcomes the continuation of work on risk assessment and risk management of living modified organisms under the Cartagena Protocol. We support statements made by the European Union, Finland, and France, and with this intervention, we supplement our statement from the informal Subsidiary meeting. We will submit our suggestions to amend the draft recommendations in writing. Chair, we are convinced that any risk assessment of LMOs, in accordance with the precautionary approach, need to be scientifically sound and performed on a case-by-case basis. We emphasize that any additional guidance materials to be developed need to be of high technical and scientific quality, focused, useful, and applicable, with the objective to effectively address the needs voiced by parties. Germany agrees to focus the efforts on the development of additional guidance materials for the risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. We think that a small group of experts with the required specific expertise should produce a detailed outline and a first draft of such additional guidance materials to ensure efficient progress. This draft could be discussed by the online forum and reviewed and finalized by the ad hoc technical expert group. The whole process should be party-driven. The process for the identification and prioritization of further specific issues of risk assessment of LMOs, agreed in Decision 913, is currently not reflected in the draft recommendations. Therefore, we suggest some additional text. In general, we are convinced that capacity building, knowledge sharing, and international cooperation are excellent tools to tackle challenges and address needs voiced by parties in an efficient and timely manner. In this regard, we request the Executive Secretary to further improve the Biosafety Clearinghouse and to provide dedicated web pages to facilitate easy access, raise awareness of all available information relevant for risk assessment. We strongly encourage making use of existing guidance materials. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Germany. Now I give the floor to Peru, followed by Austria and Switzerland. Adelante, Peru.
Please go ahead, Peru. Thank you, Chair. We recognise the importance of the open online forum and the work done by ATEG on risk assessment. We agree that we should welcome the reports and analyses that have been carried out on these studies commissioned by the Executive Secretary. Peru is a biodiverse country which has a moratorium on release of GMOs into the environment, and we recognise it's important to have guidance material on risk assessment because there is the possibility that there might be accidental or illegal release of LMOs, as has taken place already. And we still have difficulties when it comes to risk assessment of living modified fish. And we consider that the guidance and existing documentation can help us to address these issues. So we agree with the proposed decision to elaborate, or not elaborate, rather, guidance material on this for the moment. But when it comes to LMOs containing engineered gene drives, we think that this is a novel application. And we do not yet have more experience above what's been carried out in laboratory studies with confined use to see whether the instruments for analysing risk assessment that have been developed in various countries or in other organisations can actually be applied to this technology and to know the limits thereof. So developing countries, many of which have a great deal of biodiversity, may be the first ones to have to carry out risk assessments of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. So Peru agrees that we need to set up a technical group to develop guidance materials, additional guidance materials, in fact, on this subject. Finally, Peru recognises that developing guidance material on risk assessment and risk management is important and needs to be continued but we need to further strengthen capacity building at a regional level and exchange experience and protocols that already exist for managing this type of risk. I'd like to point out that was extremely fast and we did not have the text.
Followed by Switzerland and Belarus.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished delegates, a good day to all of you. Austria supports the statements already made by the European Union, Finland, France, and Germany. Austria has also provided the main elements of our position and proposed amendments already at the informal Subsidiary meeting in February, and we would like to briefly add the following points. From the Austrian perspective, a clear and transparent process is key for a fast and efficient drafting process and to achieving useful additional guidance materials for the risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. And to ensure efficient progress, we suggest performing the initial drafting in a smaller group of experts. Possible formats such as a smaller expert drafting group, for example, within an ad hoc technical expert group, may be appropriate for that purpose. The outline of the additional guidance materials and the first draft should focus on specific issues of mosquitoes containing engineered gene drives and address general issues for conducting risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. The role of an extended online forum on risk assessment and risk management would be to review first the detailed outline and secondly the first draft of additional guidance materials on risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives. The final draft of the additional guidance materials would then be developed by an ARTEC. We have modified paragraph 6 and the annex of the draft recommendations accordingly and have uploaded our statement and all suggested amendments to the web page to be publicly available. Muchas gracias, Señor Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Austria. Now I give the floor to Switzerland, followed by Belarus and Cuba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Austria. Switzerland?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you hear me? Yes, thank you. Our statement made at the informal meeting earlier this year stays fully valid, but we would like to raise the following points nevertheless. Switzerland supports first the statements of Europe, France, Germany, Finland, and Austria, and further others in the same line. Switzerland strongly believes that it is very important to ensure the continuation of the process established in Decision CP913 for the identification and prioritization of specific issues of risk assessment of LMOs that
Can you speak closer to your microphone? Yeah,
yes,
maybe.
Do you hear me better?
It's about the same.
Do you hear me better?
Yeah, a little better.
Okay, thank you. Do I have to begin again? No? Okay. I'm going.
You continue.
Okay. Switzerland took note of the analysis done by the ad hoc technical expert group on the topics for a living modified organism containing engineered gene drives and living modified fish according to decision CP913 Annex 1. But Switzerland would still be very interested in the future development of a guidance on genetically modified fish as mentioned by Mexico and others. Nevertheless, Switzerland fully supports the current proposal to focus the work on the development of a guidance on living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives, as this particular utilization raises many risk assessment and risk management as well as liability questions that has to be considered in priority. Going to the focus of the guidance to be developed, it should address general issues for conducting risk assessment with living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives. And as a first step, the focus should be on application in the near future, such as mosquito containing engineered gene drives. Finally, we'd like to make two important remarks. With regards to living modified organisms that contain engineered gene drives, which are considered as living modified organisms, Switzerland is of the opinion that as long as risks and benefits cannot be correctly assessed, as long as risk management measures cannot be properly implemented, it is necessary to refrain from releasing living modified organism containing gene drive to avoid irreversible effect to the biodiversity and unintended transborder movement. Switzerland would mention that some application of synthetic biology aimed at biodiversity conservation, such as aiming to manage IAS using engineered gene drive, could conflict with other biodiversity conservation objectives and raise a number of other conceptual and legal issues with regards to protected or threatened species, regulation of trade in wildlife products, and the compatibility of this approach with conservation and the cultural practice of indigenous people and local community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Switzerland. Now give the floor to Belarus, followed by Cuba.
Уважаемый председатель, поскольку по техническим причинам...
Chair, Belarus was unable to read its statement at the informal session. We would like to read our main points regarding item 5 here. Republic of Belarus understands the rationale behind recommendation 4 of document CBD/Substa/24/ this is too fast, Chair, and takes into consideration the views on the need to develop guidelines on risk. I'm so sorry. And therefore, on the basis of the recommendations provided by our country in the past, the conclusions of the ad hoc technical expert group meeting on risk assessment were given in document 24/5. The need to prepare guidelines on risk assessment for LM fish and on the conclusions and multiple difficulties identified in assessing living modified fish. Belarus considers that despite the fact that there are risk assessment guidelines, including those prepared by the European Food Safety Authority and other international organizations, these documents contain no specific considerations related, for example, to long-term exposure or next generation effects. Too fast, Chair. There is great uncertainty in assessing the spread of such Yes, the interpreter thanks you, Chair. There is great uncertainty in assessing the spread of such organisms in marine ecosystems, their transboundary movement. In general, given that laboratories are developing not only genetically engineered fish, but also crustaceans and other marine organisms such as algae, Belarus has already suggested that there is a need to develop guidelines on aquatic marine organisms in general. In this regard, Belarus wishes to make a proposal for paragraph 4. Calls for continued broad international cooperation, capacity building, and knowledge sharing about scientific developments in this area, potential adverse effects on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity from living modified fish and other aquatic marine LMOs, and decides to consider the development of additional guidance materials on risk assessment of living modified fish and other aquatic marine LMOs at the 11th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. In relation to the development of guidelines on risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives, Belarus supports their development and believes that such guidelines should consider and complement already existing decisions. In conclusion, Belarus would like to reemphasize the particular importance of cooperation between organizations, conventions, and initiatives, academic and research institutions on issues related to risk assessment and monitoring of LMOs, especially new generation LMOs, including synthetic biology products. Belarus underscores the particular importance of and urgent need for capacity building in risk assessment and risk management for LMOs with high proliferation potential, and for next generation LMOs in accordance with the guidelines developed under the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Belarus has provided its full statement online, and we are prepared to work with other collaborators on this issue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Belarus, and also interpreters. You went very fast. I advise you to, when delivering your statements, separate in small sentences with clear ideas, and to give a pause after you express one idea, and then allow time for the other one so interpreters can follow you better. Ahora vamos con Cuba, que tiene la palabra.
So now we're going over to Cuba to finish off the list of parties of the Cartagena Protocol. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? It's rather difficult, the sound. Good morning, Good afternoon. First of all, have a wonderful week with our working sessions. For Cuba, the development of synthetic biology from the first step onwards needs risk assessment with a solid scientific basis on a case-by-case basis. So it is urgent to create capacity in terms of technology and knowledge in developing countries such as Cuba. We're at the center of the policy for managing the LMOs in Cuba. And we realize the work that has been done by the Secretariat to organize the online open-ended forum in 2020 so that parties can make progress in examining studies about risk assessments of LMOs containing engineered gene drives and also on living modified fish. Cuba supports the proposal to not develop for the moment guidance material on risk related to LMO fish. Rather, we consider that we should give priority to better understanding this subject and have an exchange of experiences and study existing materials on this and create capacity on this subject. But we do think that we should have an ATEG set up to develop additional guidance material on risk assessment for the LMOs containing engineered gene drives, because these organisms are surrounded with high uncertainty when it comes to risk assessment and also having monitoring and supervisory activities on these. Thank you very much, Cuba.
With requests from parties to the Cartagena Protocol. It's been a rich discussion. I've been listening to specific recommendations and support to the ATEG, some views on the need for additional guidance on fish, calls to precautionary approach, many suggestions to some paragraphs on the recommendations, and also for terms of reference to the ATEG and the importance of the precautionary approach, suggestions on the language, including for mosquitoes, fish, a number of suggestions on the recommendations of this document, and also the annex on the terms of reference so far. Now, I see no more requests from the floor from parties to the Cartagena Protocol. We will now move to interventions from non-parties to the protocol, followed by other governments and observers. So I open the floor from non-parties. I see no requests from non-parties to the protocol. Now I open the floor for intervention by representatives of other governments, followed by major stakeholders groups. Remember not to exceed 4 minutes. On behalf of IPLCs, Jun Batang A, TV Tiba, you have the floor.
Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I am speaking on behalf of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. We support the ATEG report that living modified organisms are unpredictable and have possible negative long-term, permanent, and irreversible impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. In line with our statement during the informal session, we would like to reiterate the importance of precautionary approach, the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, the incorporation of indigenous and local knowledge, innovations, practices, and technologies in the risk assessment and risk management of living modified organisms, which has potential adverse effects on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and take into account risks to human health and socio-economic and cultural impacts. In paragraph 6 of the suggested recommendations, the IIFB would like to include the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples from the 7 sociocultural regions recognized by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to participate in the ATEG to develop additional guidance for risk assessment on living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives to ensure that indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent are obtained and the environmental, socioeconomic, cultural, and ethical impacts are considered. The IIFB also notes the request to the Executive Secretary, but would like to express our concern on the proposed online discussions and online forums and the current negotiations because of the connectivity issues, time zone challenges, and the requirement for party support for IPLC's proposals. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much on behalf of IPLCs. Now I'll give the floor to Farm in behalf of women organizations, followed by the Third World Network. So Farm, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the CDB Women Caucus. Risk assessment and risk management of living modified organisms is key in order to prevent future impacts on biodiversity, on natural contributions to people and people who depend on them. In this regard, the ATEC expertise is an important element to promote actions to identify and manage risks. This task could have a bigger impact if we also undertake capacity building efforts that allows people with non-expertise on biotechnology to contribute to assessing risk and or promote policies at the national and local level for risk assessments. We have concrete proposals to the suggested recommendations. On paragraph 7, to add women and youth after indigenous peoples and local communities. On annex to the draft decision terms of reference for the ad hoc technical expertise group on risk assessment, add a new section to read as follows. To analyze the relevance of promoting capacity building efforts and risk methodologies that can be assimilated by non-experts in biotechnology and in a culturally appropriate manner, to enhance the capacity to apply risk assessment measures to other sectors of society. We also recommended including consideration on local risk perception to living modified organisms with gene drives, focusing on high-value biodiversity areas, indigenous peoples, territories, areas with high endemicity, home to endangered species and wild species of high importance to IPLCs, including wild fish species. We agree with the ATEC members for the need to clear guidance on risk assessment to be developed on living modified fish. This is especially critical in consideration that living modified fish have the potential to spread across national borders, besides other challenges identified, and the implication it could have on the biodiversity and for the livelihoods of IPLCs, including women and youth. Finally, we ask for a special consideration to women risk perception, particularly from indigenous women and local women who have closer relationship with nature as native seed keepers or knowledge holders of traditional medicine. We have uploaded our statement and look forward to Paris for support. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchísimas gracias. Now I give the floor to the Third World Network on behalf of NGOs. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm making this statement on behalf of the CBD Alliance, which gathers a diverse range of views and proposals from civil society. We recall our statement to the informal session in February, which remains valid. We focus now on some text proposals so that the draft recommendation is able to ensure that the risks posed by LMOs are robustly addressed. We invite parties to support our statement or individual points therein. 1. There are fundamental risk assessment challenges for LM fish, along with socioeconomic and ethical impacts, particularly for IPLCs, for whom wild fish species are important in both ecological and cultural contexts. We see a clear need for guidance on risk assessment on LM fish, as well as further work on socioeconomic considerations in accordance with Article 26 of the Protocol. We note that several parties have called for continued work on this issue, including broad international cooperation, capacity building, and knowledge sharing in accordance with Decision CP 9/13. It is important not to foreclose this issue. We propose that paragraph 4 of the draft recommendation read, decides to consider the development of additional guidance materials on risk assessment of living modified fish. As LMOs containing engineered gene drives pose potentially irreversible adverse effects to biodiversity, we continue to call for a global moratorium on the release, including experimental release into the environment of such organisms. At the same time, the development of guidance on risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives by the ARTEC must fully operationalize the precautionary principle. If the risk assessment cannot be sufficiently reliable due to the scientific uncertainties, the environmental release of such organisms is not compatible with the precautionary principle. We propose additional text at the end of paragraph 1C of the ARTEC's TOR. Considering that where risk assessment is not sufficiently reliable due to scientific uncertainties, the application of the precautionary approach requires that there should be no environmental release of such organisms. 3. The work of the ARTEC must build on and complement existing CBD decisions on organisms containing engineered gene drives, inter alia a precautionary approach, obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of potentially affected IPLCs, and assessing the socioeconomic, cultural, and ethical impacts so as to contribute to a coordinated approach between the CBD and the Cartagena Protocol on synthetic biology as per decisions BS 7/12 and 12/24. We propose an additional paragraph 2 bis in the ARTEC's TOR. In undertaking its work, the group shall also consider the relevant CBD decisions on LMOs containing engineered gene drives and make recommendations in this regard. 4. Parties approve the procedure for avoiding or managing conflicts of interest in expert groups, as contained in decisions 14/13 and CP 9/10. It is also essential that there is full and effective participation of IPLCs in accordance with decision 14/19. We propose additional text at the end of the paragraph 1A in the ARTEC's TOR. Allow for the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities and be subject to the procedure for avoiding or managing conflicts of interest. 5. The risk assessment guidance has to be cognizant of the need to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of potentially affected IPLC and respect their rights to self-determination and to say no to any release of LMOs containing engineered gene drives in their lands, territories, and waters. These points could be reflected in an additional paragraph 6 bis. Finally, we reiterate our concerns over the inequities of formal virtual negotiations, but we do continue to participate in good faith. Thank you.
Thank you very much, TWN. Now I will open the floor for interventions from other observers. Each statement should not exceed 2 minutes. And I have A and R, Imperial College London. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We regret to see that groups representing academic and scientific research institutions are not given the opportunity to speak as major group. I'm Delphine Tizzi, working at Imperial College London with Target Malaria, not-for-profit research consortium, developing new tools to control malaria in Africa. As noted by many parties in the study commissioned by the CBD Secretariat, by several participants to the online forum, and by the ATEC experts, the current methodology for risk assessment of LMO are broadly adequate for organisms containing engineered gene drives. If parties move forward with the development of new additional and voluntary guidance materials, they should build on and be complementary to the existing risk assessment resources to avoid duplication of efforts and ensure the work is carried out efficiently. As stated by friends, coordination with other international institutions such as the WHO and FAO, as well as regional initiatives such as the West African Vector Integrated Management, would allow leveraging existing work and ensuring consistency. We'd like to highlight the publication last week of WHO second edition of guidance on genetically modified mosquitoes, addressing specifically gene drive for vector control. The additional guidance should have a clear scope, respond to specific needs identified by parties, and be based on the principle of case-by-case assessment. Parties need to first agree on scope of these guidelines, and this should be reflected in the terms of reference of the ATEG. The mechanism that is chosen to develop the proposed new documents must ensure timeliness and adequate expertise. Commissioning an independent group on risk assessment and regulatory experts, including experts with first-hand knowledge and understanding of gene drive research, would support the timely delivery of high-quality documents. The expert group could use the report commissioned by Perseus in 2019 and reviewed by the ATEG. The focus on additional guidance should not distract from or supersede the existing need for capacity building for risk assessment for all NMOs. Priority should remain to support parties that require assistance to build an understanding of gene drive approaches and of their capacity to assess a regulatory dossier. This dovetails with the broader need to ensure implementation of the Cartagena Protocol for all NMOs and not just gene drive. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much to Imperial College. I will also consult with the Secretariat about this participation of scientific or the academia as part of mailing groups. Of course, I follow the advice to conduct business as good as possible. Last intervention from observers, I see an NGO and FNIH. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. On behalf of the Foundation for the National Institute of Health, I'm Brinda Das, and the FNIH mission is to accelerate biomedical discoveries that improve people's lives. Regarding guidance for risk assessment and implementation of gene drive modified organisms, I would like to call the parties' attention to the recent publication of a newly updated edition of the World Health Organization's Guidance Framework for Testing Genetically Modified Mosquitoes. Recognizing that even with best efforts to apply available tools, vector-borne and especially mosquito-borne diseases continue to pose an enormous public health burden worldwide, the WHO has endorsed the position that all potentially beneficial new vector control technologies, including genetically modified mosquitoes, should be investigated. They likewise recognize the need for these new technologies to receive rigorous evaluation for safety and efficacy, as is expected for other public health tools such as drugs, vaccines, and insecticides. The new 2021 WHO guidance builds on earlier recommendations from the 2014 edition, taking into account the technical progress and lessons learned in this rapidly advancing field. It describes a phased testing pathway analogous to that of other new public health tools and its applicability to different types of genetically modified mosquitoes, including those incorporating gene drive. For each testing phase, it describes considerations for efficacy and safety testing, as well as ethical and stakeholder engagement responsibilities. It also reviews the multiple levels of applicable institutional, national, and international oversight, as well as existing precedents and guidance for risk assessment. The WHO guidance framework is intended to provide quality, consistency, and credibility in the processes for developing, testing, and regulating genetically modified mosquito technologies to guide decisions about whether and how these new public health tools would be used. As the CBD considers additional guidance for risk assessment of genetically modified mosquitoes, we hope the Secretariat and parties will take into account this important document elaborated over the past 3 years with the contribution of numerous experts in this field. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. With this concludes interventions on this topic. Then, after hearing your interventions, I recognize that we still have some more unsolved issues, and based on this, and also with the view to enhance the efficiency of our work, I propose a contact group for this item. When considering risk assessment, the contact group will do so based on the following specific mandate. Its work will focus on the process to develop specific guidance materials for organisms containing engineered gene drives, and work on a proposal for the annex of the draft recommendation, and on the following paragraphs which are related to the guidance process, 5, 6, 7, and relevant sections from paragraph 8. This should be the main task for the group, which will work towards a compromise. The contact group will be co-chaired by Mr. Werner Schenkel from Germany and Ms. Mtakatensi Shidada from South Africa, who are also co-chairing the contact group on item 4 on synthetic biology. A non-paper will be produced and made available 36 hours before the first meeting of the contact group. The first meeting of the contact group will take place on June 2nd from 12 to 3 p.m. Montreal time, and the second will take place on June 3rd from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Montreal time. This is also to have some balance regarding difficulties and from other time zones. Finally, I would like to remind you to make sure that you have uploaded your statements in the online system, which will facilitate the work of co-chairs and the secretariat in preparing the non-paper. Also, I would like to say a few words about the way that contact groups will operate during this meeting. Please know that you will be able to connect to the contact group 60 minutes before the start time. The Secretariat will provide technical training and testing 30 minutes before contact groups. Contact group sessions will last up to 3 hours. 1 or 2 sessions of different groups can be scheduled per day, but not to run in parallel. Contact groups are open to participation by all parties, other governments and observers. The usual practice and rules will apply to participation of observers. They may speak at the discretion of the co-chairs and give the floor after parties speak, and any substantive proposal from an observer must be supported by at least one party. As we can see in the chat today, there were many support responses of parties supporting some observers' statements. As per usual practice, these sessions cannot be recorded or shared through social media. Please note that contact groups are only accessible through the interactive systems. We ask parties and organizations to limit themselves to 1 or 2 speakers, with the understanding that remaining members of the delegation can follow the discussions as viewers, and that they may exchange their speakers at any time. To maintain the integrity of the system, we ask that no more than 2 participants from each party, non-party, or observers join as speakers. All others may join as viewers. Also, the contact groups will work in English, and accordingly, non-papers considered at the meetings of the group will be in English. As per usual practice, the outcome of the work of the contact group, the chair's report, and draft CRPs will be provided in all languages for consideration at the plenary. Well, I think we are doing very well. With this now close to the midpoint of our session, and I would like to give a break, but first, before this, maybe I'd just like to raise one concern from Brazil on the point of new and emerging issue. Of course, this issue will be taken forward at the appropriate time. So this is my proposal. I will consult also among concerned parties on this point, on this matter, to chart the best way to forward on these new and emerging issues criteria. I believe first to address these points on the contact group, and I'm thinking in a proposal to do this when we prepare the CRP. I hope this will be satisfactory for all, but of course this point will be addressed. With this, I would like to take a break of 15 minutes. As you know, there is no need to log off during the break, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes time from now, which is okay, 15 minutes. And we will continue with the next agenda item on biodiversity and agriculture. Have a good break. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break, coffee break in my case, as I did it, to continue with our work. During the break, I was consulting with Secretariat about the mandate I just gave to the contact group on agenda item 5, and taking into account that we also heard a number of suggestions on text on recommendation, my advice is that after dealing with the annex, the contact group can also revisit other sections in the recommendations as needed to cover the different views in preparation for the resulting CRP. So after dealing with the annex and the paragraphs I mentioned, I leave open the mandate to consider other suggestions to have as complete and hopefully as clean as possible a good CRP to be considered again in plenary. Thank you very much for that. Now we will start the next agenda item, which is item 7 on biodiversity and agriculture for completion on the first reading. Kindly recall that this item was considered during the 5th and 6th segments of our informal session, respectively, on the 25th and 26th February. At that time, interventions were heard from 33 parties, with 2 additional parties having submitted undelivered written submissions, 2 regional groups, and 10 observers with 7 additional written submissions. So it's already a good amount of inputs on this document. Before I open the floor for interventions, and in order to increase efficiency, I will ask those parties, regional groups, and observers that deliver a statement on this item at the informal session to request the floor only in the event that you wish to make a significant additional points to add to your previous intervention at the informal session, and to focus on recommendations in document 24/7 Rev 1. Please be aware it is a Rev 1 already. In such cases, please mention those changes briefly and provide them in writing within 12 hours of the closure of this reading. For minor changes, again, you may simply resubmit your statement. Of course, in developing the CRP or non-paper for this agenda item, all comments and suggestions made in your statements, whether on February or today, will be considered carefully. I give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce item 7 for completion of the first reading. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. To facilitate the deliberations on item 7, biodiversity and agriculture, the Executive Secretary has prepared document CBD/SubSTA/24/7 Rev 1 on the review of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and updated Plan of Action. The information document shown on your screen, the report on state of knowledge on soil biodiversity, may also be relevant to the deliberations under this agenda item. Please note that at the informal session, the Secretariat received, as you mentioned, Chair, 37 written statements from parties and regional groups and 17 from observers. All will be taken into account in addition to interventions made during this formal session in the preparation of the CRP or non-paper for this agenda item. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Secretariat. Now I open the floor for interventions on item 7, biodiversity and agriculture, starting with regional groups, followed by parties, non-parties, and major groups. So this is for regional statements. I see some NGOs requesting for the floor. It's not the time. I see Ghana, which I believe speaks on behalf of the African region. Ghana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ghana speaks on behalf of Africa. In reviewing document CBD /24/7 Rev 1 on the review of International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and updated Plan of Action and related annexes, the African region submits the following comments. Recommendation 1. On calling for the adoption of the Plan of Action 2020 to 2030 for the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity as a means to support the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the recommendation should be specific to which goal and target the plan seeks to implement. On recommendation 3, among the documents and instruments listed, the recommendation should include the enactment of appropriate legislations by governments to give legal bite to the implementation of the initiative. Africa also recommends the inclusion of development policies in recommendation 5 to read, invite parties to integrate the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity into agricultural systems and into land and soil management and development policies. Recommendation 10, requesting for the Executive Secretary to bring the recommendations to the attention of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations and to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification should be deleted. This is because under the introduction of the report in paragraph 1, the Conference of Parties recalling decision 14/30, paragraph 24b, requested the Executive Secretary to review the implementation of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity in consultation with the FAO. The organization therefore played a key role in the review as reflected throughout the document. For that matter, the FAO co-owns the report or has a big stake in it. It is therefore not necessary calling for the recommendation to be brought to their attention. Further, Africa would like to propose the inclusion of the following recommendations. In line with Objective 2, the recommendation should be capacity building for the development and transfer of knowledge. Encourage governments and other organizations to equip traditional authorities and landowners with the necessary knowledge to appreciate prioritization of land and soil conservation issues in their local government development programs. B, the public education and awareness programs should specifically center on the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity. As indicated in paragraph 13, in reviewing Objective 1 on sharing of knowledge and information and awareness raising, it came out that various interventions exist, but not on soil biodiversity. Likewise, awareness raising activities have taken place at various levels. However, these activities were not specifically directed at the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity, but cover other related topics such as erosion control and reduction of runoffs. Africa would like to further propose that recommendations should be properly aligned with the objectives of the review. Finally, Mr. Chair, Africa would like to remind all parties that a solution for sharing benefits arising from the use of DSI is particularly important in the context of agriculture and the cause for the eventual adoption of the whole post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And we look forward to starting substantial negotiation on this crucial matter very soon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ghana, on behalf of the African region. Should Secretary take note of the suggestions on the recommendations. I don't see any more requests from the floor from regional statements. So then I open the floor for interventions by parties. I see Morocco, followed by Samoa and Argentina. Morocco, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Morocco supports this statement made on behalf of the African group. Morocco underscores the importance of mitigating the direct and indirect impacts of human activity on soil biodiversity and on multiple ecosystem services that it provides. The role played by soil biodiversity is critical, and its contribution undeniable for sustainable development and the implementation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We have 5 points to make. 1, by maintaining and improving soil biodiversity through sustainable practices, farmers could make significant contributions to food and water security, as well as the sound cut out. Interpreter's note. Farmers could make significant contributions to food and water security, as well as to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. 2, Morocco would like to thank the FAO and other partners who contributed to the excellent report on the state of knowledge on soil biodiversity. This is a major reference document and an update on the scientific knowledge of soil biota and its functions and ecosystem services throughout the world. 3, Morocco emphasizes the need for effective integration into the post-2020 global biodiversity framework of the basic elements of the updated plan of action of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity. 4, Morocco believes it necessary to continue filling the gaps identified in the plan of action for soil biodiversity. In so doing, the message will get through to policymakers regarding the importance of soil biodiversity, encouraging them to support national research with a view to producing more information and data on soil biodiversity and the ecosystem services it offers. And finally, capacity building and networking research initiatives are desirable at this level with the support of donors and funding agencies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Morocco. I like to know that, for example, Mexico in the chat mentioned they will not take the floor, but they are submitting again statements, so that's a way to also save time. That will be considered as request. Now I'll give the floor to Samoa, followed by Argentina and Spain. Samoa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Samoa is making this statement on behalf of Samoa and Palau. Samoa and Palau note the review of the implementation of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and welcomes the draft Plan of Action 2020 2030. Healthy soils are essential to national food security, healthy diets, and economic development in our countries. We note there is no clear links between the plan of action and the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework and recommend this should be addressed. As noted in the statement made by SBREP during the informal SAPSTA on this item, we recognize that we are experiencing a range of pressures and stresses that directly affect soil biota. However, information on baselines and trends related to soil biodiversity is lacking in our countries. We thereby strongly support activities to increase data collection and analysis, including through building of our capacity to undertake these required assessments. We recognize the value of traditional knowledge and sustainable traditional agricultural practices to the sustainable use and conservation of soil biodiversity in our countries. We also recognize the strong links between soil biodiversity and coastal and marine ecosystem health, and the importance in reducing leaching and sediment runoff as negative impacts of some land-based activities. We rely heavily on the essential services provided by soils are particularly vulnerable to soil biodiversity loss, have limited capacity, and have significant challenges and gaps in expertise, data, and information relating to soil biodiversity. Key actions to address soil biodiversity and soil health in national policies and plans are recommended in the technical guidance documents jointly developed for the Pacific Islands by the Secretariat of the CPD, FAO, Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, and the Pacific Community in 2016 on mainstreaming ecosystem services and biodiversity into agricultural production and management in the Pacific Islands. We would like to strengthen the recommendation inviting donors and funding agencies to include a request for the GEF to provide financial assistance for national and regional projects that address the implementation of the plan of action, including mainstreaming across sectors, research, awareness raising, and capacity building, and supporting the incorporation of an ecosystem-based approach to soil biodiversity management into NPSAPs and other cross-sectorial plans. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to Samoa, also speaking on behalf of Palau. Now we give the floor to Argentina, followed by Spain and China. Argentina tiene la palabra.
You have the floor, Argentina. Thank you, Chair. Good day. As a global food producing country, Argentina has been an active participant in discussions on biodiversity and agriculture since the establishment of this thematic program in COP3 in Buenos Aires. Thus, we're extremely interested in the emerging advances on soil biodiversity knowledge, which could provide important suggestions for improving productivity of agricultural systems. We highlight that there is a large variety of strategies to conserve and sustainably use this type of biodiversity, and these strategies go beyond those listed in the discussion documents, which is why we suggest taking a flexible approach with these. In keeping with these comments, Argentina will submit changes to the draft recommendation in writing and in Annex 2. And we have the following 4 points to make on these. Firstly, as regards the summary for policymakers on the state of knowledge of soil biodiversity, we suggest taking note of this based on both its importance and also the fact that it is not a product negotiated by countries. Secondly, on the references to food systems, we request a change to read agricultural systems, given that there is no multilaterally agreed definition on food systems. Thirdly, on the Plan of Action 2020 to 2030 for the International Soil Initiative, we believe that it does not even present global priorities, but rather options to be considered for conservation and sustainable use of soil. In this initiative, under the element of political coherence, we suggest modifications to align it with other international processes and national legislation. As regards the element on awareness raising and capacity building, we suggest to delete references to the economic valuation of biodiversity. Finally, on the research, monitoring and assessment element, we request inclusions to reflect the role of national governments in this section. Fourthly, and finally, we suggest inclusion on an urgent call to developed countries to provide funding for implementation of conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity initiatives in developing countries in accordance with Article 20 of the Convention. Distinguished delegates, to conclude, we'd like to reiterate that Argentina is committed to promoting agriculture that uses biodiversity in a sustainable way and contributes to ending hunger and achieving food security. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Argentina, and also for showing this commitment to the use of our soil biodiversity. So now Spain, then China and Brazil. But first of all, Spain. Thank you, Chair. Spain reiterates its intervention that it made in the informal sessions of SBSTA. To add to what we said earlier, we add that it is important that the 2020-2030 Plan of Action for the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity should include amongst its priority global actions the development of bioindicators that facilitate the description of soil biodiversity as an important component in soil description studies. And we will submit comments in writing with specific amendments on this matter, adding to also what we said in the informal session. Thank you. Thank you, Spain. Thank you for being so brief.
Brazil and Indonesia. China, you have the floor. Go ahead, China.
You hear me, Chairman? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to soil biodiversity, our previous statement at informal meeting still valid. We'd like to add 2 comments to the recommendations. First, we need to pay attention to the issue of global food security. Countries should ensure food security when conducting biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Specifically, we like to add, after recognizing that, to read, recognizing that ensuring food and nutrition security is the primary goal of agri-ecosystem services, and so on. The second is to add a paragraph following paragraph 7 of recommendation to read, invites developed country parties, other governments, and relevant organizations to provide technical support to enable developing country parties with economics in transition, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, China. Now I give the floor to Brazil, followed by Indonesia and Switzerland. Brasil tiene la palabra.
Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the outset, we appreciate your understanding regarding Agenda Item 4. Mr. Chairman, my delegation takes note with appreciation of the document SBSTA-24 7 Rev 1, and we are grateful for the dedicated work that resulted in the draft plan under our consideration. This is a good example of cooperation with FAO, and we encourage the Secretariat to emulate this experience in other cooperation exercises in different topics. Brazil attaches great value to the work dedicated to the conservation and the sustainable use of soils. We have specific public policies to promote the sustainable use of soils, including in cooperation with the FAO. Brazil considers of utmost importance the mapping of our country's soil in order to have better knowledge of the soil, aiming at promoting its sustainable use, as well as designing conservation and restoration policies more in line with the reality in the field. Therefore, with regard to the action plan, we believe that priority should be given to promoting policies and technologies that would enable parties to improve their mapping capabilities in detailed scales, acknowledging the difference in management of tropical soils and those present in more temperate regions. Once we've completed this exercise, we would be better placed to recommend sustainable practices in soil management that are science-based and tailored to addressing the specific realities in the field according to each biome. The current gaps in data on soil biodiversity in some parts of the planet might render premature actions related to indicators, as stated in paragraph 19e. As mentioned by my delegation in our informal meeting, the action plan should also address commitments related to access and benefit sharing. For example, when proposing actions related to data collection and the use of traditional knowledge on soil biodiversity and management, the document should ensure that parties will uphold CBD's commitment on fair and equitable benefit sharing with the country or community of origin of that particular resource. It should also, when necessary, demonstrate that prior informed consent was obtained. For example, the action plan should encourage the development of benefit sharing mechanisms related with soil organisms, considering the potential to develop new products and medicines in line with the third objective of the Convention. Furthermore, it could also seek to identify sources of financial resources for the implementation of the action plan, including ABS mechanisms, considering the soil biota potential to develop different products, including pharmaceuticals. We will present our suggestion to the draft action plan in written. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Brazil. Now I give the floor to Indonesia, followed by Switzerland and South Africa. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished welcomes the review of the implementation of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and the Plan of Action for the year 2020 to 2030. To re-emphasize our previous intervention submitted and convey in the informal session, Indonesia would like to also re-stress the importance of awareness, reintegrate conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity. Welcoming the plan of action, Indonesia will support all effort and hard work. Indonesia is of the view that the plan of actions also need to be mainstreamed and strengthened, and parties need to uphold the importance of monitoring framework for every step of the actions. Indonesia also supports the future strong collaboration with the other UN bodies, especially FAO and the UNCCD. I thank you, Chair. Muchas gracias, Señor.
Terima kasih, Indonesia. Now I give the floor to Switzerland, followed by South Africa and Ecuador.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and distinguished delegates. Switzerland welcomes the review of the International Initiative on Soil Biodiversity, as well as the publication of the first State of Knowledge of Soil Biodiversity in 2020 and the outcomes of the 2021 Global Symposium on Soil Biodiversity. We would like to thank the FAO and the Global Soil Partnership for their leadership in the implementation of the International Initiative and for the preparation of the updated Plan of Action 2020 to 2030. Conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity are particularly important to ensure soil fertility and therefore transformation of agriculture and food systems towards more sustainability and resilience to enhance the achievement of the SDGs. Mr. Chair, so far, there is no specific reference to soil in the goals and targets of the post-2020 framework and its monitoring framework. Switzerland therefore suggests that SBSTTA strongly recommends to the open-ended working group to consider integrating specific references to soil in existing targets, such as, for example, in the target related to sustainable use and the associated headline indicators. Finally, Mr. Chair, Switzerland encourages strengthened collaboration and cooperation with the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, especially its Science Policy Interface and the UNCCD 2018 to 2030 Strategic Framework. We have submitted these and additional proposed changes to the draft decision and the updated plan of action in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Switzerland. I've been hearing lots of expression of support and the collaboration with FAO. It's important also to know that the FAO has a mainstreaming biodiversity strategy into agricultural sectors as well. We were focused here on soils and the two annexes. And I hope also recommendations for co-chairs of the open-ended working group will be addressed properly in agenda item 3 that we will take also later. Now I give the floor to South Africa, followed by Ecuador and Kenya. South Africa, you have the floor.
South Africa supports the statement made by Ghana on behalf of the African Group. South Africa supports the draft plan of action 2020 to 2030 for the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, and considers it useful in supporting the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and welcomes the report of the State of Knowledge on soil biodiversity. South Africa knows the importance of soil biodiversity in underpinning the functioning of terrestrial ecosystems, and therefore most of the services it delivers, and recognizes that activities to promote the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity services are key in the transition towards the achievement of more sustainable food systems, food security for all, and to enhance the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. South Africa is of the view that although the conservation and sustainable use of pollinators is of great importance, many developing countries are yet to fully assess the status of pollinators, in particular insect pollinators. South Africa recognizes this as a critical step towards understanding the various drivers, threats, and trends of pollinators. Therefore, financial support through the GEF and other donors and funding agencies should be made available to support pollinator assessments in developing countries. Recognizing that sustainable agriculture can contribute to the conservation of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and associated functions, South Africa supports the integration of conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity into agricultural systems and into land and soil management policies. Therefore, South Africa supports the decision to address the drivers of soil biodiversity loss and land degradation. South Africa agrees that further research is needed in order to address gaps identified in the plan of action. In addition, South Africa is of the view that soil health be incorporated under the various programs and interventions that seek to raise awareness and education, enhance knowledge, promote and protect soil biodiversity, and that it should be reflected in relevant national reports and NBSEPs. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, South Africa. Ahora doy la palabra a Ecuador, followed by Kenya.
So now Ecuador, then Kenya, and then Colombia. But first of all, Ecuador. Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, good evening, good day to all of the distinguished delegates. We would like to thank the FAO for its efforts in developing and taking into consideration the Plan of Action 2020-2030 for the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity. We take note of the plan and we urge FAO to continue with work to raise awareness about the importance of soil biodiversity in its processes and strengthening bridges with the CBD and other conventions that may be related to the management and protection of soil. For Ecuador, we have made important progress in incorporating soil biodiversity into agriculture with our national agro-farming plan for 2020 to 2030. In this plan, we consider important elements related to soil biodiversity to ensure that we have environmentally friendly agriculture. When it comes to the recommendations to the COP, we have some suggestions. At the end of one, instead of saying means of implementation of the posted GBF with voluntary guidance for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework post-2020. And then under 3, we recommend that instead of saying encouraging the parties and other governments and relevant organisations to support implementation of the Plan of Action 2020 to 2030, rather than saying inviting parties, other governments and relevant organisations, and then continue with the drafting. So saying inviting instead of encouraging. Then under 7, we suggest that we should add including, before we say within the framework of the Global Soil Partnership, and then under 8, after the phrase financial assistance for national and regional projects, to add the following, especially for developing countries. And then we continue with the wording to clearly talk about the scope of the plan of action. We should refer to the particularities and specificities of the countries. Thank you very much, Ecuador, for those suggestions. And now I'm going to give the floor to Kenya, then Colombia, followed by Uganda. Kenya, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Kenya associates with the statement made by Ghana on behalf of Africa. Further, Kenya appreciates the efforts made by the Secretariat, FAO, and all other partners who were involved in the review and the generation of the draft plan of action, as captured in Annex 2 of the document CBD/Substar/24/7 Rev 1. The 4 key issues identified in the draft plan are indeed responsible for the continued decline of soil biodiversity globally. In order to address the identified inadequacies, Kenya strongly supports adoption of the action plan and invites parties, development partners, and agencies to support its implementation. In addition, though not a subject of this agenda item, the role of pollinators in biodiversity conservation and use is of great importance, just as been reiterated by South Africa. Similar to soil biodiversity, pollinator diversity and the population are on the decline, and yet pollination is a keystone process in both human-managed and natural terrestrial ecosystems. Pollination is critical for food production and human livelihoods, and directly links wild ecosystems with agricultural production systems. The vast majority of flowering plants species only produce seeds if animal pollinators move pollen from the anthers to the stigmas of their flowers. Without these many interconnected species and the processes functioning within an ecosystem would collapse. Mr. Co-Chair, Kenya is aware of the previous initiatives and efforts by the Conference of Parties to address the worrying declining trends of pollinator diversity and the populations. However, despite this initial effort, pollinator diversity and population are on the decline due to continued habitat fragmentation and unfavorable agriculture as well as other land use practices. This decline is bound to frustrate any initiative meant to ensure food and nutritional security globally. Kenya therefore calls for concerted effort to continue supporting programs geared towards enhancing habitat connectivity and promoting pollinator conservation practices. This is There is a need to build on the successes of the International Pollinator Initiative and develop an action plan for the conservation and the use of pollinators, similar to that for soil biodiversity, that is the subject matter in this agenda item. Kenya proposes that SBSTTA makes a recommendation to that effect for consideration by the Conference of Parties in its next meeting. We are willing to work together to develop the text for the recommendation. Thank you, Chair.
Asante sana, Kenya. Now I give the floor to Colombia, followed by Uganda and France.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Colombia reaffirms the position it presented during the informal sessions on this agenda item and welcomes the proposed Plan of Action 2020-2030 of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity. Likewise, we highlight that this plan of action is a strategic document for strengthening mainstreaming of biodiversity across sectors, as well as for reinforcing synergies and coherence with implementation of the Rio Conventions and other related agendas such as the Sustainable Development Goals. Even if the draft plan of action provides an excellent basis, we consider that certain aspects related to means of implementation could be further reinforced. We recommend making a reference to the need to promote a strengthening of capacities in developing countries by improving research capacities and technology transfer. Also addressing the issue of negative incentives and elimination or reform thereof, turning them into positive incentives for sustainable soil management. Also, promotion of the mainstreaming of soil biodiversity into sectorial policies could be accompanied by mainstreaming into territorial planning and management instruments. Thus, we believe that a new paragraph needs to be included in the recommendation, which invites the parties to include soil biodiversity in sustainable soil management policies and urban planning, and also in ecosystem restoration plans. We would also like to highlight that in Annex 1, especially the recommendations found in paragraphs 47A until 47F, that they are important since they refer not just to farmers but also to other land users, as well as an invitation to have indicators on soil health, which should be borne in mind when talking about indicators in the post-2020 framework. Turning now to paragraph 50C, it is key to make available indicators on this subject, and in order to improve consistency, we suggest the following inclusion at the end of the paragraph, namely, with a view to establishing a robust suite of indicators related to soil biodiversity in the post-2020 framework. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Colombia.
Thank you very much to Colombia.
Or to Uganda, followed by France and Peru. Uganda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and distinguished delegates. Uganda supports the submission by Ghana on behalf of the African region in relation to the revisions of the recommendations as well as the additional recommendations proposed. Uganda recognizes the need for enabling policy environment and coordinated frameworks that support an agricultural transformation agenda with integrated systems to increase agricultural production and productivity while protecting and managing and restoring biodiversity. We support proposed efforts regarding continued use of the biodiverse food and production systems. Community seed banks with supporting outreach systems have been tested in a few communities and found to be effective. Support in this area is needed to cover more communities. Uganda therefore underscores the need to promote measures to reduce food loss and waste. In our case, the largest percentage of food loss occurs during post-harvest handling. Uganda therefore calls for support in capacity building to reduce post-harvest losses and value addition. Uganda notes the proposed interventions regarding public and private incentives to encourage investment by farmers in biodiverse production systems and management practices that support both sustainable agricultural and food systems transition. We recommend that the African plan for implementing the FAO strategy on mainstreaming biodiversity across agricultural sectors should include research activities for assessing, monitoring, and providing solutions for the negative impacts of agricultural practices on biodiversity to promote sustainable agricultural practices. Uganda therefore supports the draft recommendations, but we proposed additional text to paragraph 3 and paragraph 5 as follows. In paragraph 3, which starts like encourages parties and other governments and relevant organizations to support the implementation of the Plan of Action 2020-2030, we added the word and capacity development. In paragraph 5, we added the words and their national biodiversity strategy and action plans, where we invite parties to integrate the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity into agricultural systems, land and soil management policies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Uganda. Now I give the floor to France, followed by Peru.
Bonjour, merci Monsieur le Président.
Hello, good day. Thank you, Chair. Good day, everybody. France confirms the positions put forward during the informal sessions. We commend the important work of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and the quality of the final document. Indeed, France considers that conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of soil biodiversity are literally the roots of sustainable agriculture and are critical to a more global transformation of food systems. The latest global reports show a severe degradation of soils and their functioning all over the world, threatening the stability of the ecosystems and services on which we depend. It is therefore urgent to reverse these trends now and thus prevent as quickly as possible the risks of decreasing production and displacement of populations. This is the driver of France's involvement in promoting agroecology and the 4 per 1,000 initiative. To further this work, France recommends a better mainstreaming of soil biodiversity in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework by recommending that the open-ended working group take into account the importance of soil biodiversity when developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and provide guidance on the linkages and synergies between the elements of the draft global framework and those of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity. Secondly, recommending that the Conference of the Parties at its 15th meeting adopt the Plan of Action 2020-2030 of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, with changes proposed by the EU and its member states, particularly all references to agroecology, agroforestry, and soil restoration. Thirdly, invites United Nations Environment, UNEP, the FAO, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils of the Global Soil Partnership, and the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative to support integration of soil-related targets and actions, including monitoring and reporting, into the Global Biodiversity Framework. Inviting parties to provide, finally, on a voluntary basis, information on the ways in which they are implementing the plan of action and the results achieved. Thank you.
Merci, la France. Ahora doy la palabra a...
So I'm now going to give the floor to the last party, namely Peru. You have the floor, Peru. Thank you, Chair. Peru recognises that activities to promote conservation and sustainable use of the goods and services that soil biodiversity provides are fundamental for agro-livestock production systems and to address climate change in order to ensure food security and achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is why we need to implement the Plan of Action for Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity 2020-2030, which will require joint work and synergy between the various sectors and actors involved, so that we can then generate and adopt the necessary changes in agricultural and natural systems, as well as with water and land management policies. This will then lead to more sustainable and biodiversity-friendly agricultural practices. We urge that short, medium and long-term mainstreaming takes place of the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity into agricultural systems through good practices pursued by different actors, such as small and medium-scale farmers. And this could be achieved if we have effective governance with policies and regulations that are available at different levels of government. Likewise, it is our view that advances in soil research and new technologies point to the need that we need to update land and soil management policies. This would lead to improvement strategies and the use of more environmentally friendly technologies and inputs, such as minimum tilling, green fertilizers, biofertilizers, and biocontrol products, amongst others. This would guarantee a balanced and dynamic system that is friendly for the environment, biodiversity, and human beings. Chair, the commitments that will be made to implement the Plan of Action for the Conservation and Use of Soil Biodiversity 2020-2030 could be made more tangible with cooperation from the GEF together with other donors and funding agencies that provide technical and financial assistance for national and regional projects. Thus, it is relevant to place emphasis on the resource mobilization mechanisms for this topic. Thank you very much, Chair. And we are attaching a revision matrix to this statement, which gives details on our specific contributions and modifications. We would appreciate you considering those. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peru.
No more requests from parties to the floor. Then we will move to interventions from non-parties, followed by organizations, beginning with major groups. I don't see requests from non-parties. I will start giving the floor to FAO, given the importance of this collaboration with this initiative and the strong support that I heard from most parties to continue working. So I give the floor to FAO. Please, FAO, raise your hand.
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Chair. Allow me to read the statement on soil biodiversity by the Food and Agriculture Organization. So FAO reiterates its commitment towards the sustainable management of soils, particularly the sustainable use of and management of soil biodiversity. FAO has been coordinating and providing the technical and policy support to the successful implementation of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity. Through its Global Soil Partnership, the importance of sustainable soil management has been promoted at all levels. Soil biodiversity loss has been identified as one of the 10 major global soil threats. Following an inclusive and collaborative approach, FAO and its GSP and partners have prepared the report State of Knowledge of Soil Biodiversity, Status, Challenges and Potentialities, This report was launched in December 2020. The summary for policymakers has been made available to SBSTA. FAO's GSP, its ITPS, the CBD Secretariat, the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative and the SPI UNCCD have successfully organized recently the Global Symposium on Soil Biodiversity following a virtual format, bringing more than 5,000 participants from 161 members. The outcome document, Keep Soil Alive, Protect Soil Biodiversity, will complement the plan under this item to address the soil biodiversity gaps that were identified during the symposium. FAO, together with the CBD Secretariat, have prepared the updated plan of action for this international initiative, which is currently under consideration and that received many feedback. The plan highlights the urgent need to scale up sustainable soil management in order to prevent soil degradation, including the further loss of soil biodiversity. Healthy soils can constitute a game changer to the global negative trends, including food insecurity, environmental degradation, poverty, biodiversity loss, and pollution. It is important to highlight the need to include healthy soils and soil biodiversity into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as otherwise the direct connection between above and below ground biodiversity will be ignored, and the effort to protect only above ground biodiversity will not yield the expected targets. FAO and its Global Soil Partnership are committed towards the execution of this plan and call resource partners to invest on the sustainable use and management of soils, as well as its biodiversity at national, regional, and global levels. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, FAO, and congratulations for the work. And we look forward to continue working together, CBD and FAO, on this important matter, essential for life and for food. Now I give the floor to Nexus on behalf of NGOs. So Nexus, you have the floor. Microphone to Nexus, please. Meanwhile, we continue with FARN on behalf of women organizations. FARN, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Saludos desde Buenos Aires.
Thank you, and greetings from Buenos Aires.
On behalf of the CBD Women's Caucus, it is key to include indigenous peoples, local communities, and women's knowledge and wisdom in the management, restoration, and recovery of soils from agro-industry and other destructive productive activities. In this line, we have a series of concrete recommendations to document CBD/SBSTTA-24/7/Rev1. On Annex 2, Draft Plan of Action 2020-2030 for the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, Section 1, Introduction, Para 6, add gender roles to be reflected in the plan besides local context and other specificities. On Section 2, Purpose and Objectives, Para 9, add women and youth besides parties of the governments, IPLCs, relevant organizations and initiatives, among those this plan aims to support. On Para 11b, towards the end of the para, add gender roles so that it would read, taking into account national circumstances, land use type, geographic region, gender roles, and the vulnerability of marginalized communities. On Section 3, Scope and Principles, Para 14, add women and youth to relevant organizations, landowners and land managers, farmers, indigenous peoples and local communities, and civil society. On para 17, add indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth, and civil society, while ensuring multi-stakeholder participation. On section 5, key elements and activities, para 20b would read, encouraging the use of sustainable soil management practices and restoration. On element 1, policy coherence and mainstreaming, add women and youth to the rational, besides indigenous peoples and local communities and all relevant stakeholders. Activity 1.6 would read, adopt policies that provide economic incentives to producers or property owners that implement practices that promote or increase the biodiversity of soil, especially for indigenous people and local communities, women and youth in developing countries. On element 2, encouraging the use of sustainable soil management practices, add and restoration to the title of the element, and add women and youth to the rational. On activity 2.1, add restoration among sustainable practices and add increased agroecological practices. And on activity 2.4, add end agroforestry systems to the end of that para. Finally, on element 3, research, monitoring, and assessment. On activity 3.7, add women and youth among those receiving capacity, and on activity 3.8, add with free, prior, and informed consent. We have uploaded our statement and look forward to party support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Fan, on speak of women, on behalf of women. Now, let's try again with Nexus on behalf of NGOs.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam, Mr. Chair, this intervention is delivered on behalf of the CBD Alliance, and it gathers a diverse range of views and proposals from civil society. We refer to our previous statement and that of Friends of the Earth Europe in February 2021 and wish to emphasize that soils are the world's greatest source of biodiversity and are of fundamental importance for agricultural biodiversity and food. Soils are complex ecosystems in their own right. They result from long-term processes and need centuries to evolve and develop their full potential. They also store large quantities of carbon. However, using soils for carbon offsetting is not acceptable. All the well-known problems arising from other forms of carbon offsetting apply even more strongly in the case of soil biodiversity. Soils are being degraded and lost worldwide, mainly due to large-scale industrial agriculture, which relies heavily on inputs of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. These are highly destructive of soils and must urgently be phased out. Excessive amounts of animal manure must be brought to levels that do not exceed critical loads. We suggest adding this to Activity 2.1 in Annex 2. Different types of land ownership and tenure have very different impacts on soil biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity and soil degradation is frequently linked to industrial agriculture, which is large-scale corporate and export-driven, causing major land grabbing with often violent expulsion of small farmers. Hence the vital importance of IPLC rights and tenure systems, which allow for more cyclical and holistic farming, agroecological approaches, in fact. Their management practices, knowledge, and land use techniques of both men and women must be taken into account for the recovery and maintenance of healthy soils. Agroecology and agroforestry should be central to the whole document, as they make a major contribution to the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity. We suggest the following amendments to the text. Remove biochar and biosolids from Activity 2.4 in Annex 2. Prioritize ending perverse incentives and subsidies for industrial agriculture that facilitate the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, including soils, as addendums to paragraph 4 of the draft COP decision and point 1.6 of the Plan of Action in Annex 2. Add spatial planning as a new activity, 1.12 of Annex 2, recognizing this can be an important tool to conserve soil biodiversity. Include references to CBD decisions 3.11, conservation and sustainable use of agricultural biodiversity, and to 5.5, agricultural biological diversity, review of phase 1 of the programme of work and adoption of a multi-year work programme to make sure these important parts of CBD work don't get lost. Finally, we note the complete absence of any mention or target related to soil in the current draft GBF, a major omission considering its fundamental importance for food, health, biodiversity, including agricultural biodiversity and climate. We therefore suggest inserting paragraph A into the Substa decision, which could read as follows. Substa recommends to the open-ended working group to include a target or element on the conservation and sustainable use of soils in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We would like to ask for the support of parties to our statement or to individual parts of it, and are happy to supply language on these points. Finally, we reiterate our concerns in relation to virtual negotiations, but we participate in good faith in an effort to bring the voices of the most disadvantaged groups. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Nexus, on behalf of NGOs as well, and your suggestions. Of course, we're trying to do our best. We have very limited time to do our best. And please use the chat if there is some support, if there's support from parties to observers' suggestions. I would like to close this agenda item. I will give the floor to the last observer. I think we can still use 15 minutes probably on the next agenda item to make progress. Time is precious here, and I see general support with concrete precisions on the documents, and I will explain how I will going to continue. So I'll give the floor to last intervention from IPC. You have the floor.
And am I here? Great. Thank you, Chair. The International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty welcomes Item 7's focus on soil biodiversity, which has long been and still is best preserved by peasants, pastoralists, forest dwellers, indigenous peoples, and other small-scale food producers who feed the majority of the world. However, there appear to be two very serious omissions from the draft of the Action Plan 2020 to 2030. First, there's no mention of agroecology in the action plan. And second, there's a continued lack of recognition of small-scale food producers as identified by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas. The action plan should place emphasis on the fundamental role of agroecology in restoring, maintaining, and developing soil biodiversity. In element 2, encouraging the use of sustainable soil management practices. Neither agroecological practices of peasant and indigenous communities nor related traditional knowledge are directly mentioned among activities that preserve soil biodiversity. As stated in point 45 of the background document and as recognized in Decision 13/3, paragraph 27, the Conference of the Parties recognized the important contribution of indigenous and local communities, in particular as managers of centers of origin of agricultural diversity, and their role in the management and restoration of critical ecosystems, ecological rotation, and agroforestry. So it's therefore even more glaring omission that our role in the maintenance of biodiversity is not given explicit recognition in the action plan. Rather than repeated use of the ill-defined sustainable agriculture, the action plan must call for an agroecological transition if we are to genuinely protect and preserve biodiversity below and above ground. We recommend the addition of a fifth objective to the action plan. Number 5, recognizing, supporting, and securing the role and rights of indigenous peoples and small-scale food producers in maintaining biodiversity through agroecology. Finally, we join others in warning against the inclusion of language not defined under the CBD, such as nature-based solutions, that can potentially open doors for mitigation pathways, such as large-scale afforestation, that are neither natural nor solutions and distract from genuinely transformative actions. The CBD has its own well-defined terminology from in ecosystem-based approaches and should continue to use these rather than adopting new, vague, and undefined terminology. Industrial agriculture, especially deforestation and monocultures for livestock feed, the overuse of antimicrobials in intensive livestock production, and the attendant loss of distinctive breeds of plants and animals, have severe consequences for soil fertility and biodiversity. Action must be directed towards agroecological solutions, which support biodiversity in all its forms and at all levels, genetic, species, and ecosystem. This must be addressed in the currently proposed targets 1, 6, 9, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 in the GBF. And we hope to see parties support our calls for recognition of agroecology and the role of Indigenous peoples and small-scale food producers in conserving and sustainably using soil biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, IPC. I see that we have just a little bit more than 10 minutes, then I will give the floor to the last two speakers, two observers, to close this item and then to start tomorrow with agenda item 3. So I'm going to give the floor to TNC followed by UCC LAN. Those are the two observers. I see Canada asking for the floor, and I also see that parties are supporting statements from observers. So in the chat you'd see secretaries noting this, but I see Canada refrain asking for the floor. Probably was on that direction, but that's the use of the chat at this stage. So I'll give the floor to TNC followed by ARUCC LAN to finish today. So I encourage you to be very brief and concise. TNC, you have the floor.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Nature Conservancy and WWF. We welcome the document prepared by the Secretariat for this agenda item. Protecting and restoring soil biodiversity is critical for both eradicating food insecurity and malnutrition and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. Therefore, it is important that the GBF targets not only include action to protect and safeguard soil biodiversity, including by promoting and safeguarding soil conservation and sustainable use by Indigenous peoples and local communities, but also address direct and indirect drivers of soil biodiversity loss. In particular, as GBO5 points out, it is critical that we deliver transitions towards sustainable food systems and sustainable agriculture. For these reasons, we are proposing that the GBF includes a comprehensive target focusing on a nature-positive food system information. In this context, we propose that the recommendations of the document CBD/SBSTTA-24/7 Rev1 advise the co-chair of the open-ended working group to integrate 3 issues in the targets of the draft 1 of the GBF. Firstly, the protection and recovery of soil biodiversity and the scaling up of investments in soil restoration and rehabilitation, for example, in a target on food system transformation. Secondly, the recognition and support of the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in conservation and sustainable use, including their relation with soils and the need to respect their free, prior, and informed consent. And thirdly, actions to address all direct and indirect drivers of the loss of soil biodiversity, since this loss presents a threat to global food production and food security for all. We are seeking parties' support for this proposal. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, TNC, also on behalf of WWF. And now last speaker, last observer, ARUCC LAN. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, thank you, Chair. I speak on behalf of the University of Cambridge Conservation Leadership Alumni. In line with many recent publications, we propose that agricultural landscapes provide an opportunity to expand global conservation area coverage at local to global scales. Agriculture dominates many national economies and encompasses vast tracts of land. We must address agriculture's major contribution to biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and soil and water creation. To do this, agriculture must be viewed as part of an integrated spectrum of land-use planning for biodiversity conservation. Agroecosystems can improve soil biodiversity, as well as maintain fragments of natural habitats. In addition to emphasizing the importance of soil biodiversity to food production, the CBD could also focus on the massive stock of agricultural land where targeted international policy and investment into mixed farming regimes can actively support biodiversity conservation. Echoing the submission by IUCN, emphasis should be placed on creating conditions that enable farmers to achieve sustainability at both the farm and the landscape level, and to reduce the risk they face during the transition. Furthermore, requiring biodiversity and healthy soils, recognizing biodiversity and healthy soils as an asset to agricultural systems and vice versa, can resonate with a broader audience, leading to more politically feasible solutions for land-scale biodiversity conservation. To conclude, we need much stronger support for leveraging agriculture to conserve biodiversity and push for a net positive impact of agriculture to global biodiversity within this decade, lest miss a monumental opportunity to conserve global biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we finish list of speakers on this agenda item. I see that we have a lot of common understanding on the draft recommendations. There were many precisions to be included on the recommendations and in the annexes. Then I will prepare a conference room paper with the help of the Secretariat. I would like to remind you to make sure you uploaded your written statements to the Secretariat website within 12 hours of the closure of this reading. We will take up item 7 again to review and approve the CRP during our third block of plenaries from 7 to 9 June, ensuring that the conference room paper is available in all languages at least 36 hours in advance of that plenary session. Please be sure to check the schedule tab on the meeting homepage on a regular basis so you will know when a particular CRP will be reviewed in plenary. So we don't have more time now to address agenda item 3. I heard also comments on recommendations for co-chairs of the open-ended working group on soils. Tomorrow we will address agenda item 3. But please be very clear that, for example, this agenda item 7 is producing a CRP, and all CRP documents in the future will turn into an L document that will be approved on a face-to-face meeting. And this is after the third meeting of the open-ended working group. So we should bear in mind that these documents will go for adoption of the conference of the parties. So advice to co-chairs on agenda item 3 in the preparation of draft 1 of the framework on biodiversity is part of what Substa will send as part of the report of the meeting and the report of the chairs. So please take a look on documents, in particular the report of co-chairs. If you see that, for example, soil biodiversity is well reflected there, so this is a matter of timing. All CRPs will be addressed by the COP. And I fully understand the concern on soil, so we need to be sure that it's adequately represented when we deliver our advice to co-chairs, but not through CRPs, due to this logic and the mechanics on these negotiations, because when it turns to an L document, it will be very probably in China after the third meeting. I hope that explanation can clarify the situation and the importance of this advice that we will deliver later. I don't know if there are some housekeeping messages from Secretariat. Before closing, we have just 3 minutes to finish our session. I see no request from Secretariat to take the floor. Then, with this, we finish our deliberations on item 5 and item 7. Thank you very much to all for your cooperation. I think we're doing great in time. I hope we can continue with the same pace for tomorrow. So see you at the same time tomorrow, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much. The session is adjourned. Bye-bye.